Namaskar, Anyang Hasanika. Hope you and your family are safe and healthy. This is Sonu Trivedi, Director of the Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center at the Embassy of India in Seoul, welcoming you all to this special lecture organized today on this digital platform commemorating 158th birth anniversary of Swami Vivekananda, whose message remains relevant in contemporary times, not only for India, but for the entire world. I'm extremely honored to have amongst us Mr. Hindol Sengupta, the award-winning author and Vice President of Invest India, who is joining us live here today from New Delhi, along with the presence of Her Excellency Shri Priya Ranganathan, Ambassador of India to Republic of Korea, for today's special lecture on the life and times of Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda, the modern monk, as Hindol himself, Hindol calls him, in his book, shows that there was a lot more to Swami Vivekananda than the spiritual leader who floored the West in 1893 with his address at the Parliament of World Religions. To quote Hindol, he loved French cookbooks, invented a new way of making khichdi. He was interested in the engineering behind shipbuilding and the technology that makes ammunition. He's also an utterly modern man, consistently challenging his own views and embracing diverse, even conflicting arguments. It is his modernity that appeals to us today, unquote. Swamiji understood the need for secular education, economic development, and spiritual knowledge as a pillar to moral upliftment of humanity and foundation for building up a new India. He was concerned about the spread of education and for the emancipation of the poor masses and also of women. It was his concept of social engineering with a touch of spiritualism which stood him apart and makes him as relevant in recent times of the 21st century India and the world as he was in his times, that is, in the last quarter of the 19th century. Swami Vivekananda's contribution to India's Renaissance, including its emergence as an independent nation, is profound. Let me just end here, and I now call upon our Ambassador, Shri Priya Ranganathan, for her opening remarks. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Sonu. First of all, I'd like to welcome our guest speaker today, Hindol Sengupta, who's the author of a book on Swamiji, which I have not had the good fortune of reading yet. But I hope that I will manage to do so before we have our next interaction, Mr. Sengupta, so that we can discuss a little bit more length about what you have, what your perceptions are. Good afternoon to all my colleagues from the embassy and to all those who have joined us on this for this very important event when we are marking through our virtual celebrations the birth anniversary of Swami Vivekananda. Today is the 158th birth anniversary of Swamiji, and through this event, through this tribute, we seek to pay tribute to a man who managed, through his epic speech at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago way back in 1893, to alter the mindset of the Western world about the richness of Indian philosophy, who managed to bring about global recognition of Hinduism as one of the great religions of the world. We pay tribute to a man who managed to balance his innate spirituality and deep knowledge of Hinduism with secularism, tolerance, and universal acceptance. We pay tribute to a man who made lasting contributions to the spread of education, to the upliftment of the poor, and to the emancipation of women. We pay tribute to the man who founded the Ramakrishna Mission back in May 1897, through which both monks and lay people could jointly offer social service, including through running of hospitals, schools, colleges, hostels, rural development centers, and conduct relief and rehabilitation work for victims of natural calamities, not only in India, but across the world. When I look back on the life of Swamiji, I'm struck by all that he managed to achieve within this very short lifespan that he had on earth of just 39 years. I wish I could have achieved even a even a fraction of what he did in my much longer time on earth than he did in his 39 years. He really made the most of every moment that he had. And I think his reach and his influence at a time when the world was not connected as it is today, when we did not have electronic media, when we did not have the kind of deep spread of even print media, when interaction meant long and fairly tedious journeys on the seas, when intermingling of cultural influences was unknown, when we did not have easy tools through which we could translate from our native tongues to a wider community in order to communicate. At such a time, in such a milieu, when colonialism and the myth of white supremacy was at its peak, Swamiji managed to spark the imagination of the world about the richness of Indian traditions, and also to give a clarion call for the humanistic values of Vedanta and the underlying unity of God, regardless of whatever path we may take in order to reach Him. I think these themes were inherent to the Indian civilization, which welcomed myriad faiths across the centuries into its embrace, be it that of Christianity, be it that of Islam, be it that of Zoroastrianism, and which also encouraged and enabled the evolution of many new faiths within our own soil, the faiths of Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, even Sufism. I think these were all born within the crucible of India. And such deep-rooted secularism and universal acceptance was perhaps unknown in Western civilizations, which in those days approached Eastern civilizations with a rather Christian missionary zeal, seeking to convert what they regarded as heathens to their own faith. Now, those days are unfortunately way long behind us, and India and Indians are proud to speak about the philosophical wealth of our own traditions, as well as the traditions that we have made our own. We are very proud to speak about the multiple cultures and multiple faiths that we nurture within our land. But we must really use our imagination to think about the power and charisma of Swamiji, that he was able to not only hold the attention of the largely Western audience back in 1893, but also persuade them to consider the merits of his arguments, that there can be multiple paths leading to the same divine, and that there is fundamentally a unity between man and between man and nature. I think it is this principle that lies at the heart of Vedanta, and which epitomizes the India that we have stood for and continue to stand for. That Swamiji managed to not only inform his audience of these thoughts, but also convince many of their logic and their merit is testimony to his depth of knowledge, his clarity of thought, and the conviction of his speech. To my mind, this marked a major step in the claim of the people of India to break free of the shackles of colonial rule. And this was also the ultimate discourse on the secular and humanist values that most modern societies hold dear today, but which was not perhaps so commonplace at that time in the 19th century when he voiced these thoughts. Swamiji's philosophy and abiding belief in the underlying equality of all and the presence of divinity in all led naturally to his commitment to service. He taught us that the divine is present in all beings, human, animal, nature, and that we should therefore be willing to offer our service to all, as by doing so we serve God. The new pattern of monastic life that he advocated adapted age-old monastic ideals with modern values, according equal importance to personal growth and social service, allowing men and women of all religions, races, and castes to come together in service and in faith. I think we standing today where we are, we should appreciate what a giant step that was at that time, away from the traditional shackles of rigid orthodoxy of the Indian society of that era, which was deeply divided on lines of caste, faith, and even sex. Are these values and ideals relevant today? Absolutely so. Today, the world needs this clarity of thought and commitment to the values of secularism and tolerance, acceptance, and humanism, perhaps even more so than it did at that time. The challenges of the 21st century may be different from those of the 19th, but the solutions lie in these very same principles and ideals. People around the world continue to face problems of crisis of identity, problems of intolerance, problems of misunderstanding, perhaps even problems of fanaticism. By remembering and living by Swamiji's philosophy, we will be able to move forward towards a more peaceful, a more accepting, a more tolerant, and a more humane world. It was in 2018, on the occasion of the 125th anniversary of Swamiji's speech at the World Parliament of Religions, that the Indian Ministry of External Affairs decided to pay a lasting tribute to Swamiji's role in creating and expanding the cultural footprint of India by renaming around 20 of our cultural centers across the world as Swami Vivekananda Cultural Centers. Our center in Seoul is one such, and we are very proud of the work that we do here. And we hope that the work that we are doing and will continue to do at the center will be true to the traditions and the principles that Swamiji stood for, and that we are able to live up to his name by so doing. I do not want to stand between you and our main speaker today, Mr. Sengupta. I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that we have really exciting discussions going forward. Thank you so much. Dhanyavad. Kamsamnida.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for your welcome address and also kickstarting this special lecture by Mr. Hindol Sengupta. We now move over to the invited speaker for today, Mr. Hindol Sengupta, who is the Vice President and Head of Research at India's investment promotion agency called as Invest India. He's an award-winning author of 9 books, including The Modern Monk, published by Penguin India in 2016. In 2019, his book titled The Man Who Saved India was awarded the Best Non-Fiction Book Award at the Valley of Words Literary Festival in India. In 2018, his book, Being Hindu, Understanding a Peaceful Path in a Violent World, became the first book on Hinduism to win the Wilbur Award given by Religion Communicators Council of America. He is the youngest writer to be nominated for the Hague Book Prize given by Manhattan Institute in memory of the Nobel laureate economist F.A. Hague, and to win the PSF Award for Social Contribution in India. He is also the founder of Grin Media, which runs the Grin online platform on the intersection of science, spirituality, and entrepreneurship, and the foreign policy and globalization platform called as the New World Order. Mr. Hindol is a regular contributor on economic affairs for the New Indian Express newspaper and on the foreign policy at Espinia Online. He has worked as senior fellow at the Center for Civil Society and also as a visiting fellow at India's leading think tank, the Observer Research Foundation. He was trained in business and finance as a Knight Bagehot Fellow at Columbia University and in international relations and history as a Chevening Scholar at Worcester College, Oxford. Friends, let us hear from Hindol himself what Vivekananda means to us today. It is a personal pleasure and delight to welcome you once again, and we look forward to your insights. Over to you, Hindol.
Namaskar, good afternoon. Thank you very much to the Honorable Ambassador, to Ms. Trivedi, all colleagues and friends in Korea and India. Thank you very much for this kind invitation. I am absolutely delighted and very, very pleased indeed to be addressing a Korean audience, in fact, for the first time. I have been very privileged to speak around the world, including in America and the UK, but never before in Korea, and I'm particularly pleased today to get the opportunity to do so. I will take off from what the Honorable Ambassador was saying about Swami Vivekananda's contribution and talk today about what he means to us today. Many of these spiritual figures become two-dimensional. Like Swami Vivekananda, in many cases, I like to joke to my audiences, the only thing many people know about him is that one quote of his, arise, awake, and do not stop until the goal is reached, which is all very well. But what about the living, breathing man and his contribution, not just to Indian civilization, but to global, the contribution to global, the cause of global peace, the cause of global harmony, and most importantly, the cause of worldwide of man really understanding herself. This is the key point that Swami Vivekananda's life depicts. I am fascinated by Swami Vivekananda because of 3 or 4 reasons. Number one, he's palpably human. As Ms. Trivedi was mentioning, here was a monk who was not only a great spiritual leader, but he was not cut off from the world in a distant, maybe Himalayan plain, far away from the world, so to speak. Swami Vivekananda immersed himself in the world. In fact, there is this wonderful story that Swami Vivekananda's own spiritual master, Ramakrishna Paramhans, well, Swami Vivekananda, once he began to understand his own spiritual journey, went to Ramakrishna Paramhans and said, look, the journey is truly to go inside, to understand myself. Therefore, what role do I have in the world? I should cut away from the world and just go deeper and delve into myself. And here's the most interesting thing. His master told him that how selfish of you that the spiritual treasures that you are discovering within yourself, you want to keep only to yourself. You must go and tell the world about this. And therefore, Swami Vivekananda is this epic, historic figure because he's really the first Hindu monk, Hindu scholar, Hindu philosopher who, in a sense, crosses the ocean, reverses the journey, overturns the colonial gaze, so to speak, which was always from west to east. He takes the east to the west. He goes and gives his sermon in America, in Chicago, and then across America, in England, in France, and other places. Swami Vivekananda takes the west, so to speak. And remember, this is the most interesting thing. The ambassador mentioned the missionary sort of zeal of certain Christian missionaries and so on and so forth. Swami Vivekananda spoke very powerfully against this. But his journey is really important because he shows that you can speak very powerfully about the ills of certain religious activity and yet not discriminate against the religions themselves. Swami Vivekananda, even today, the Ramakrishna Mission, because Swami Vivekananda spoke highly of many, spiritual figures, including of Jesus Christ. Swami Vivekananda's, the mission that he started, the Ramakrishna Mission, even today celebrates Christmas. Because remember the great saying that Ramakrishna Paramhans, Swami Vivekananda's spiritual master, had given, and I'm going to say it in Bengali and then translate. He said, Joto mot toto pot. As many as there are ways, as many as there are opinions in human beings, that many are paths to the divine. That many are paths to God. That many are paths to reach the ultimate truth. Because the spirituality that Swami Vivekananda taught came straight from the Bhagavad Gita, came straight from the Upanishads. It was Vedanta at its most sublime. And Vedanta at its most sublime teaches that at the end of the day, the truth is to be found within you. I'm writing at the moment a book on the Ashtavakra Gita, one of the most sublime texts, perhaps the most sublime text in Vedantic philosophy. And the Ashtavakra Gita is something that Ramakrishna Paramhans encouraged and prodded and pushed Swami Vivekananda to read. And their philosophies, their worldview came from this. That sects and creed and religions come much later than the truth. The divine truth is one, and all paths, if followed with great sincerity, could lead to the divine truth, which always is one. And this is a message Swami Vivekananda took from India to the West. Remember, I find Swami Vivekananda absolutely fascinating because of his confidence. Remember, he was a citizen of a colonialized nation. India was under British rule when Swami Vivekananda lived. And yet, at a time when many people would have felt a certain hesitance, a certain deference to the West, Swami Vivekananda reversed the gaze of the colonial. And he was able to go and say to the West that perhaps today, that is in his time, India was a colonial nation, but India's eternal spiritual civilizational truths were far beyond the little domain that India found itself politically in that moment. Its spiritual truths, its civilizational truths were eternal. Why is Swami Vivekananda fascinating? Because Swami Vivekananda, at a time when even the West is plagued by divisions, Protestant versus Catholics, this sect versus that sect, there are all these sort of turmoil. Swami Vivekananda rises in Chicago and says, man is no sinner. Man is essentially divine. It is just that human beings haven't, most of them, recognized that divine spark within them. And therefore, if every soul is potentially divine, if every human being is potentially divine, then divisions between men and men, women and women are fundamentally flawed. Remember where he is saying this. Swami Vivekananda had the confidence to say and talk about the unity of man in a still racially segregated society in America. Swami Vivekananda in America says that long before the West allowed women into universities and to study, his alma mater, Calcutta University, opened its doors for education of women. Swami Vivekananda says at a time when women did not have that much freedom in public life, Swami Vivekananda said that without the power of Matra Shakti, without the power and the energy of the feminine divine, without the role of women, the world cannot succeed. And therefore, remember, one of his primary disciples was a woman from the West, Sister Nivedita, who was later called Sister Nivedita, a woman who followed Swami Vivekananda as his disciple throughout the world and indeed into India, and wrote a beautiful book on him, The Master as I Saw Him, explaining his philosophies to the world. Swami Vivekananda was a great connoisseur of food. When I was writing my book about Swami Vivekananda, how much he immerses himself in the world, he used to write diary notes after diary notes of recipes of things that he had eaten in different parts of the world. There are wonderful stories of him going to Paris and then to London and then to New York, and then writing in his diary, comparing the breakfasts that he had eaten in different parts of the world and the merits and demerits of the food. There's this wonderful anecdote. Swami Vivekananda is leaving a lecture session in the West and gets up into a carriage with a disciple, and they drive away, and the master, Swami Vivekananda, is silent for a long time. So the disciple feels that perhaps Swami Vivekananda is lost in thoughts of God or spirituality, and doesn't want to disturb him. But a long time go by, and after a long time goes by, the disciple asks Swamiji, are you really immersed in the thoughts of God? are you all right? Is there something new and profound that you have discovered that you want to share? And Swamiji, who's completely lost in his thoughts, turns to the disciple and says, what I finally realized what was in the recipe of what we just ate at this place when I was giving a lecture. I was thinking about there was something in the ingredients that I couldn't understand, and I was thinking about that. A man who cooked for his disciples, a man who's so immersed in the world, a man who wrote poetry, a man who taught his disciples to sing. Swami Vivekananda engaged with the realities of his time. Remember also, India's national movement for freedom really begins with Swami Vivekananda, because Swami Vivekananda had a nationalistic zeal. It is only, and he actually thought of becoming a revolutionary himself. It is just that when he met his spiritual master, he realized that his role was even bigger. And I write in my book that Swami Vivekananda probably met one of the most influential arms makers of that time, because he was interested in revolutionary activity. But once he discovered spirituality, he realized that anything to do with, any radical movement was still very limited. He had a much bigger role for all of mankind. But his thoughts, his ideals had been used and would have been used again and again and again throughout India's national movement for freedom from colonialism. So in a sense, Swami Vivekananda is one of the birthplaces of where nationalism comes from. I'm also the biographer of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. And Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, when he was in prison, read Swami Vivekananda and was inspired by him. So Swami Vivekananda's role multifaceted role in setting up centers at a time when it was unheard of that Indian places of worship would be set up in the West, Swami Vivekananda showed the way. Even today, some of the most sublime places of Indian civilization and culture and philosophies and spirituality are the Vedanta centers in the West. When I used to live in New York, I used to go constantly to the Vedanta centers. There are two of them in New York. And these centers that Swami Vivekananda himself created really have made an impact in bringing people together beyond the divisions of the world. Let's talk a little bit about Swami Vivekananda and also the politics of his time. Swami Vivekananda showed the path that you can deny and object to racism and colonialism, and yet at a human level, not cut away the colonizers. This is very interesting and a very profound thing to understand. When Swami Vivekananda, the spiritual master, looked at a human being, he saw the human being beyond the structures of the world. So Swami Vivekananda could embrace the West. Many of his critics at that time said, well, you're going and engaging with the West, but we are a colonial nation. And his answers was, that's why we have to reverse the gaze. That's why we have to embrace the human beings, while at the same time fighting against the political structures of discrimination. He shows the path to a peaceful renaissance against colonialism. In a sense, his vision precedes Gandhi's. Gandhi and non-violence. What comes before Gandhi and non-violence? Swami Vivekananda. Because Swami Vivekananda shows that you can embrace the colonizers as human beings because you recognize every soul is potentially divine. And yet you do not have to accept the political structures that come with colonialism. You can reject and break those shackles and yet embrace the human beings. That is Swami Vivekananda's great lesson in political work. Let's talk a little bit about Swami Vivekananda's lessons in spirituality. Today, especially after COVID, there is more talk in the world than ever before on how human beings could learn to live with themselves, go within, find peace in solitude. How solitude and meditativeness is not to be equated with loneliness. This is a fundamental pillar of Swami Vivekananda's teachings and his meditative practice, the Raja Yoga. The yoga and the meditative practice that Swami Vivekananda taught, the power of divine solitude, is today more relevant in the world than ever before. It is as powerful as, for instance, the Vipassana practice taught by the Buddhists. Because Swami Vivekananda taught an Advaitic Vedantic practice of meditation and profound solitude, which he argued and showed is very different from loneliness. This solitude is the solitude, the meditative quietude through which human beings can go closer to the divine. And today, more than ever before, when many parts of the world are still in lockdown in COVID, Swami Vivekananda's message of a non-sectarian divinity to be found in individual meditative quietude resonates and reverberates as one of the great and profound answers that humanity is looking for. Joto mot, toto pot. As many as there are opinions, as many as there are ways, that many are paths and ways to God. This message in a world torn by divisions, in a world plagued by divisions, rises above the clamor, rises above the din. And Swami Vivekananda rises beyond any label that you can put on him, any structure that you can put on him, and offers freedom to every individual who might care to listen, so that they might find not a divinity outside, but the divinity inside them, because every soul is potentially divine. I'm going to conclude by talking a little bit about how Swami Vivekananda became the man he was. Indeed, he died only at the age of 39, and quite like the Honorable Ambassador, I also wonder that, truly compared to what he achieved by the age of 39, many of us perhaps would never achieve even in our lifetime. However, my apologies, sorry, Delhi is very cold, not colder than Seoul, but cold enough. I want to conclude by talking a little bit about how he became a monk. I talk about in my book that Swami Vivekananda was a naughty boy, as it were. He was a really naughty child. He was such a naughty child that his mother always used to be, traumatized by him. And when I was really young, I was really naughty, and my mother used to tell me the story that his mother was also really always hassled and harried by him. But Swami Vivekananda, beyond the structures of being a son, being a familial man, when he found divinity, when he found Sri Ramakrishna Paramhans, there's a wonderful moment where Swami Vivekananda is a very young boy, really, barely in his teenage, is going around asking people in Calcutta one fundamental question: have you seen God? And he goes to one great philosopher. Many of you may have heard of the name of Rabindranath Tagore, a philosopher from the Tagore family, not Rabindranath, but another philosopher from the Tagore family. And he goes and asks this philosopher, who's a Tagore, have you seen God? And he just looks at his eyes and says, you have the eyes of a yogi, of a monk. And Swami Vivekananda, who's an intelligent person, an intelligent young man, thinks to himself, that's not an adequate answer. That's not a good answer at all. And then he sort of is told about this, this unlettered village priest who is in the Dakshineshwar temple, and he goes because people tell him you must go and meet him and so on and so forth. And he goes and asks Ramakrishna Paramahansa, have you seen God? And I write in the book that this is one of the seminal spiritual questions and spiritual moments in modern Indian spiritual history. The moment when Swami Vivekananda asked Ramakrishna Paramahansa, have you seen God? And Ramakrishna Paramahansa says, of course I've seen God, I see him every day. And that shocks this young man. He thinks to himself, my God, this is impossible. What is this man saying? And then he says, ask Ramakrishna Paramahansa again, well, can you show me? And he says, of course, I can show you very easily because I see him every day the way I see you. And then Ramakrishna Paramahansa holds the hand of Swami Vivekananda. And Swami Vivekananda later writes that everything changed for him in a moment, because in a sense he realized what his master was saying, that God was in every human being, that the divine was in every human being. And if we go looking for him outside or looking for God outside ourselves, we are chasing an illusion. The divine is fundamentally in each of us. And that realization is truly God realization. And once that realization comes, kindness, compassion, empathy comes naturally. You know, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was asked once, what do you think Buddhism is in one word? And he said, Buddhism is kindness. When I was lecturing once in America on Swami Vivekananda, not far from Chicago where he gave that lecture, a student asked me, well, this is what His Holiness the Dalai Lama says. What do you think is Hinduism then in one word? And I shared something which I want to share with all of you. I said, Hinduism to me is joy. Because remember, the great promise of the Upanishads, as Swami Vivekananda reminded us again and again, is Sat Chit Anandam, eternal bliss and happiness and joy. Because remember, once you realize the divinity in you and in every other living individual and every other living thing, what can you be but happy? And God knows the world needs to hear this message of Swami Vivekananda again and again, perhaps more than ever before today. Because truly, what we need today is a happier world. And I bring to you today, and I'm really fortunate, ladies and gentlemen, to have brought to you today. I've had the opportunity, because of the kind invitation of our embassy in Korea, of the Honorable Ambassador and all her colleagues, this eternal message of Swami Vivekananda, that there is happiness to be found. It is to be found in all of us. It is to be found in each of you. And that happiness is very far from the little impulsive happiness that we find when we buy something or some material acquisition. This is an eternal happiness and bliss that will always stay with you. That is the message of Swami Vivekananda for the world. And that's why his message is universal. I thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this fascinating lecture, Mr. Hindol, and sharing with our friends here in Korea his message of happiness, his spirituality. And let me just take forward from where you have just ended, like your phrase, Jato Mat, Tato Pat. So taking cue from here, let me quote few lines from Swamiji's famous speech, where he himself quoted a few lines from a hymn, which he remembered to have repeated from his earliest boyhood, which is every day repeated by millions of human beings. And to quote Swamiji, as the different streams having their sources in different places, all mingle their water in the sea. So, O Lord, the different paths which men take through different tendencies, various, though they appear crooked or straight, all lead to thee. In fact, this aptly summarizes what you said, Jato Mat, Tato Pat. So let me just since we have all heard Mr. Hindol, I would request some of our participants from Korea and some of them, they have also joined from India. If you have any questions, you can just raise hand. We will invite you. Meanwhile, let me ask, there is a question in the chat box. One of our friend, he is interested in knowing Swamiji's view on linguistic diversity. So Mr. Hindol, you can just speak, and meanwhile, we'll take up other questions.
I'm so glad somebody brought up language, because this debate about English language and its use and so on and so forth keeps happening. Swamiji, remember, was absolutely fluent, not only in Bengali, which was his mother tongue. He was, of course, absolutely fluent in English, which is why he was able to, attract the world and go and speak in various parts of the world. He was absolutely fluent in Sanskrit, which was the language of his spirituality. And he possibly, because he, remember, before he headed out to the West, he walked the length and breadth of India. And therefore, he had possible knowledge and working knowledge of several Indian languages. So Swamiji, look, I mean, all of these divisions, whether it's linguistic or otherwise, Swamiji tended to subsume all of them within himself to show a path that would go beyond all of these divisions, and really to make these divisions only tools to help us attain the larger goal of happiness.
Thank you. Meanwhile, just let me just pose a personal question that I have in mind. In fact, you have aptly mentioned in your lecture how Swamiji focused on the feminine divine and the role, like the leading role women plays in the world, and how, like, you narrated about Sister Nivedita. So in this context, what do you have to see when you see so much violence and the problems that women face in the society even today? So would you like to comment on this further? Your personal comments.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think this is one thing that disappointed Swamiji in his lifetime. And had he been alive today, this is something that would have disappointed him today. The kind of violence, the kind of patriarchy that we still see, sadly. We've come a long way, but we still see so much of it even today, with terrible incidents every day around the world. And I think Swamiji's answer would constantly be only one, that in order to change the world, we must change individual human beings. Until individual human beings don't become better, until men don't find that peace and happiness and really become better within ourselves, we cannot help the world become better. And the only way to help men who perpetrate and perpetuate patriarchy and violence against women to heal is for them to heal from within. Punishing them is one solution, but a deeper solution is for them to really realize some deeper truths and heal from within. And truly, I have to say, I was raised to be a feminist by my mother. And, I personally, and as a disciple of Swami Vivekananda, I truly feel very strongly about the terrible patriarchy that we see around the world even today. And I think, therefore, even more important that Swamiji's message reaches every part of the world to fight against this malaise.
Thank you. Just we'll just take a couple of questions, and since we had the time for 1 hour, so we'll try to wind it off within an hour. Just one question on majority-minority divide that we have today. Your views on that, please.
So I think, again, so Swamiji would say, again, on all religions, Swamiji was very happy to point out what are the problems in different religions as he saw them, including his own religion. But he was happy to talk about the good things also that different religions have taught. And his point of view was very honest, very, very upfront, and very, straightforward, that he was against conversions. He believed that conversions, and especially conversions, mostly happen to be coerced, either using material, benefits or some other form, sometimes violence. And he was really deeply against conversions. But he believed human beings should follow whatever path encapsulated in the phrase that we have been saying again and again, Joto Mot, Toto Pot. People should follow whatever path they believe to be true, as long as they don't interfere in somebody else's belief systems, especially using coercion or violence to try and convert another person. That, he believed, was one of the core problems between religions. And if the problem of, trying to convert somebody else actually goes away, then many problems would be resolved.
Thank you. Thank you. One message is there in the chat box where a friend is trying to ask his message for a good society. In fact, you have already spoken, but just to be very precise, if you can just
yes, his message for a good society is very, very clear and distinct, and I'm happy to repeat it. A good society doesn't exist in vacuum. A good society really is made by good human beings, by good people. And his message is, how can we create, how can we, help people to become better versions of themselves? And how do they become better versions of themselves? By realizing the good within them and the divine within them. So his message really is, make better human beings in order to make a better society.
There are many other questions, but since some of them are just similar, I'm just trying to shortlist them. Meanwhile, I again have a personal comment. In fact, as in the beginning also, I had just focused, and as you have elaborated in your speech, he focused on education and economic development. In fact, when you look at the process of nation building and the process of development, in fact, we see that education and economic development, these are the two pillars of great society. So here, how do you think we can reinforce? In fact, when we talk about the emergence of new India and what we are doing, what our present Modi government is doing towards building up a new India, towards transforming India. In fact, these are the two pillars. So here, how do you think we can further reinforce Swamiji's ideas and take it forward?
One of the ways that emancipation will come, which Swamiji spoke very freely and frankly about, was to really open the doors of information and education to every single person, including at the very grassroots. This was a fundamental pillar of Swamiji's vision: expansion of education and information to enable enlightenment to the very grassroots, and break the fact that these were usually kept to the elite of society. I think today we are again seeing that sort of an information and educational revolution that is based on the spread of digital technology right to the very grassroots. And I have written many times in different essays and articles that this will have and is having a transformative impact on our today and on generations to come, because the kind of knowledge and information that is today at the very hands and the very palms of people at the very grassroots is transformational. It has never happened in the history of India and in the history of the world, right? So this transformation, if used well, can have a really powerful impact on people being able to empower themselves better with education and knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you. There is a question. In fact, one of our friends wants to know more about Advaita Vedanta. If you can elaborate it further.
So we only have a few more minutes, and Advaita Vedanta is a whole ocean in itself. But let me just say this. Advaita Vedanta is really what's the great Shankaracharya taught, and many, many other teachers. And the most recent and the most prominent one, of course, was Swami Vivekananda. And Advaita Vedanta's philosophy is just this, that there is only one single truth. The truth is the Brahman, as it's called, the pure consciousness or the divine consciousness, right? And how do you realize that divine consciousness is the journey of Advaita Vedanta, right? And if you read, for instance, like I said, I've been writing a book and commentary on something called the Ashtavakra Gita, which is the most sublime text of of Advaita Vedanta. And if you read it, you will realize the reiteration is just one, that there is a Brahman, or there is a supreme truth to be realized inside us, and realizing that divine force or God or whatever you want to call it is the journey of our lives. And our freedom lies in discovering or realizing that divinity within us. So that in a nutshell is what Advaita Vedanta is. But of course, there's a whole ocean of knowledge around it, and maybe another day we could do a full session only on Advaita
Sure.
Vedanta.
Yeah, there is a question by one of my colleague from Delhi University. She says, what could be Swamiji's message to students in contemporary scenario? Since today we also celebrate the National Youth Day, so your message for the youth.
Well, Swamiji is a youth icon. I always tell my younger audiences when I go to school, especially, that, Swamiji is the ultimate rock star. He truly is that rock star persona, and he's really wonderful. I think Swamiji's message, if there is one to the youth, is very simple. Swamiji had a definitive idea that the youth, if they empower themselves with spiritual knowledge and education, can have a transformative impact on the nation. And we have seen this again and again, that what he said was absolutely true. And if there is one lesson of Swamiji, to go back to that quote that I was talking about, when he says, arise, awake, and stop not until the goal is reached, what he's essentially saying is that if grassroots youth at the grassroots get empowered, realize the potential within themselves, they can actually change the society that we live in, and transform the society that we live in, and transform for the better and without violence. It would be a revolution which would be a revolution of compassion, not a revolution of violence.
Thank you, Hindol. In fact, there are many more questions. Some of them are again overlapping, and I'm sure many of our participants, they must have got the answer to those questions already. And some topics are again, as you have just said, needs a special lecture. Some of our students, they just want to know about Hinduism, about again his views on happiness, which you have already spoken. But let me just ask you, there is a question by one of our Korean students who is studying philosophy in Delhi University, and he wants you to recommend one good book through which he can understand philosophical relation between Ramakrishna Paramhans and Swami Vivekananda.
So I would look out for a book called Infinite Paths to Infinite Bliss. It's published by Oxford University. I'm just going to look up the name so that I'm giving you the name absolutely correctly. I don't want to, make a mistake on this because, quite like me, you are also interested in the same subject. Sorry, it's called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. It's called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion. It's written by a scholar monk of the Ramakrishna Mission and published by Oxford University. What I'm going to do to help the student is I'm going to put this on the chat. I'm going to put the name of the book on the chat. I'm also going to say that it's published by OUP. You can look at this book, and I think this will really help you.
Formally thank Mr. Hindol Sengupta on behalf of the embassy. And before we conclude, let me quote few words which Swamiji wrote before his Mahasamadhi to a follower. It may be that to quote him, it may be that I shall find it good to get outside my body, to cast it off like a worn out garment, but I shall not cease to work. I shall inspire men everywhere until the whole world shall know that it is one with God, unquote. With these words, let me now wrap up the discussion and give a great round of applause to our special speaker, Mr. Hindol Sengupta, and all invited guests and live participants from India as well as Korea. At this time, when the whole world is experiencing an unprecedented crisis because of the spread of COVID-19 virus, social distancing, and lockdowns world over. The Cultural Center here in Seoul has initiated some of the online activities in its endeavor to keep in touch with the students and Indian cultural enthusiasts in Republic of Korea. I'm sure today's special lecture on the occasion of 158th birth anniversary of Swami Vivekananda would have further reinforced our hard-pressed attempts to connect with the hearts and minds of people in Korea, which in fact we have been doing since the establishment of this cultural center. It is also my pleasant duty to express gratitude to all the individuals and institutions associated with the establishment and success of this institution for a decade now, which is named after Swami Vivekananda, which rightly embodies the ideals for which Swamiji himself stood for. At this moment, I would like to acknowledge the dynamic leadership of our Ambassador Sri Priya Ranganathan and the team of very motivated and dedicated colleagues at the Embassy of India and the team of Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center for the support for our outreach activities and promoting India's soft power and its linkages with Republic of Korea. A big thanks once again to people of Korea who have always been so open and receptive to cultures across the world. And to all our friends present here today. Stay tuned to our social media handles for more updates about our upcoming events. And do write to us, giving your feedback and keep us informed about any new ideas and suggestions for deepening the cultural cooperation and people-to-people ties between the two countries of India and Republic of Korea. Looking forward to your participation in our future events. Thank you. Kamsahamnida. Thank you. Thank you all once again. And thank you, Hindol.
Thank you very much. Thank you.